Johnny Carson's 7 greatest regrets are now uncovered. Over 3 decades, Carson welcomed America into their homes each night. With his sly grin and easy interview style, he came across as part of the family to millions. As the face of The Tonight Show, he built an image so smooth that audiences believed they knew him personally. Yet behind the polished charm and famous golf swing, Carson carried regrets that never left him. A longtime NBC executive who worked with him for over 10 years admitted Johnny was the most guarded star the industry had ever seen. What the public witnessed wasn't the man himself. It was a carefully crafted mask that covered the disappointments and mistakes that haunted him privately. Today, we're sharing the 7 regrets Johnny Carson never admitted publicly. These were personal sorrows and career missteps that revealed the human being behind the television icon. They aren't gossip pieces, but accounts confirmed by those who knew him best. Writers, producers, family, and close confidants all remembered moments Johnny later wished had gone differently. But first, it's important to see why Carson's most painful regret hit him so hard, and why a man who entertained millions ended his days in isolation, unable to balance success in public with failure at home.
By my next guest, Joan Rivers, whom I don't think is going to look when she comes out like she does on the back of the cover. Would you welcome Miss Joan Rivers?
Produced Joan Rivers. For years, she was his trusted fill-in host until she took her own show on Fox. After that, Johnny cut her off forever. His mistake? According to those close to him, Johnny later admitted he had been far too harsh, especially after Joan's husband took his own life. He refused every call she made. It stopped being about business, and it stayed unresolved for the rest of his life. For years, Joan Rivers filled in on The Tonight Show, entertaining audiences while Johnny was away. Their banter on screen seemed effortless, with Johnny often laughing at her sharp humor. Off-camera, the relationship looked equally strong, as Carson personally guided Rivers on the art of hosting. But in 1986, everything changed when Rivers accepted Fox's offer to host The Late Show without telling Johnny first. His producer, Fred De Cordova, later said Johnny only learned of it from Fox's press release. To Carson, it was the worst kind of betrayal. His reaction was immediate and final. Rivers was banned from The Tonight Show, and every attempt at reconciliation failed. Even in 1987, when her husband Edgar Rosenberg died by suicide, a moment that might have softened most hearts, Carson kept his silence. After Edgar's passing, Joan tried calling Johnny to hear at least a few words of sympathy, a former NBC page recalled. But he wouldn't answer. She kept trying to apologize until his retirement. Later in life, Joan Rivers spoke openly about the break, regretting her choices, but also pointing out how extreme Carson's response had been. She told reporters, "I was devastated that Johnny never reached out after Edgar died. That had nothing to do with show business." Sources close to Carson said that in his final years, he quietly admitted his reaction had gone too far, acknowledging that while he was hurt, his coldness had been unnecessary. By then, the chance to repair things had passed. Joan stayed unwelcome on The Tonight Show until Jimmy Fallon finally invited her back in 2014, 9 years after Johnny's death.
You've got to remember something, Eileen. There's something called kidding on the square. Divorce is very painful for Johnny. He's a very sensitive man.
Divorce was one of Carson's most painful experiences. He was deeply affected. Second came marrying Joanna Holland without a prenup. Carson surprised her with wedding papers on their anniversary. 3 years later, she surprised him with divorce papers and left with more than $20 million. His regret? He admitted privately to Ed McMahon that he should have never married without legal protection. Carson's third marriage highlighted the impulsive, romantic choices that repeatedly cost him both emotionally and financially. On September 30th, 1972, he presented Holland, whom he'd been dating for years, with marriage papers at what she thought was only an anniversary dinner. It was typical Johnny, both romantic and reckless, wrote his lawyer Henry Bushkin in his memoir. He never asked anyone's advice, never had lawyers draft a prenup. He simply decided to marry and went through with it. 9 years later, in 1983, Holland filed for divorce. The settlement, among Hollywood's largest at the time, included roughly $20 million in cash and property, plus their bare estate and a portfolio of stocks. The blow was made worse because it wasn't the first. His second wife, Joanna Copeland, had also walked away with a huge settlement after their 1972 split. By the time Holland left, Carson had given nearly $30 million to ex-wives, a loss that left him deeply resentful. After that divorce, Carson grew bitter about relationships, said a Tonight Show writer. He slipped angry jokes about marriage into monologues that weren't part of the script. The audience laughed, but his friends knew the bitterness was real. Ed McMahon remembered Carson telling him soon after the divorce, "Ed, never marry without a lawyer present. Love fades, but alimony stays forever." This cynical outlook shaped Carson's fourth marriage to Alexis Mass in 1987, which was protected by a thorough prenup and endured until his death. Third was alienating his son, Rick. His youngest child lived a troubled life, battling mental illness, substance abuse, and time in psychiatric care. Johnny kept his distance. His regret: when Rick died in a 1991 car accident, he realized too late how much he had failed as a father. Carson's cheerful television persona clashed with his real-life role as an often distant parent to his 3 sons from his first marriage to Jody Wolcott. Of all those relationships, his bond with Rick was the most fractured and the most tragic. Rick faced ongoing struggles with mental illness, reportedly including bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. These issues led to erratic behavior, repeated DUI arrests, and at least one forced psychiatric hospitalization in the 1980s. Johnny was simply unprepared to deal with Rick's problems, said a family friend. He came from that Midwest tradition where emotions were hidden and mental illness was ignored, so he withdrew. This lack of connection created a painful cycle of distance neither of them ever repaired. As Rick's troubles became harder to ignore, Carson withdrew even more, unable to face problems beyond his grasp or control. Those close to the family recalled that Carson usually responded to Rick's difficulties by sending money instead of being there personally. Johnny's way of fixing family matters was to sign a check, said one longtime associate. He wasn't without compassion. He simply lacked the emotional skills to confront something as heavy as mental illness. Instead, he buried himself in work and left his lawyer to handle practical issues. The heartbreaking conclusion came on June 21, 1991, when Rick Carson lost his life after his car went off an embankment near Morro Bay, California. He was only 39. On The Tonight Show, Johnny mentioned the tragedy briefly, thanking viewers for their sympathy before moving on with the show. Away from cameras, though, friends said he was shattered, always wondering how things might have changed if he'd been more involved. After Rick's death, Carson would occasionally bring him up while drinking, said one close friend. He'd confess things like, "I should have been there more," or "I never knew what to do for him." It was one of the rare times Johnny openly showed regret. Richard Pryor was another case of remorse. Pryor, considered one of the greatest comedians of his era, rarely appeared on Carson's stage. Why not? Too volatile. NBC executives shared the concern. Later, Johnny admitted that Pryor was one of the finest talents they had missed out on. Throughout the 1970s, Pryor reshaped comedy with fearless takes on race, sex, and society. Critics called him a genius. Other comics dissected his timing and style, while his films smashed records. Yet, in the middle of this brilliant run, Pryor was largely absent from The Tonight Show, the ultimate showcase for stand-up. A show talent coordinator explained that Carson felt uneasy with Pryor's edgy material. Carson admired precise timing and structure, but Pryor's raw, unfiltered delivery made him anxious, both as a fellow performer and as the host of a mainstream program. The rare times Pryor did appear, the exchanges felt stiff and often needed heavy edits. Producers feared outbursts, and Johnny couldn't find his usual chemistry. Carson thrived on control, while Pryor embodied unpredictability, recalled a writer who knew them both. It wasn't personal, nor mainly about race. Carson just wanted predictability, and Pryor specialized in shaking audiences with brutal honesty. By the 1980s, as Pryor's health declined and his influence became undeniable, Carson started to rethink his stance. In off-the-record chats with staff and in one interview, he praised Pryor as one of the all-time greats and admitted regret for not featuring him more. A producer from Carson's later seasons remembered, "Around 1990, Johnny told me, we should have found more ways to highlight Pryor. That was our mistake." From Carson, who seldom admitted wrongs, this was rare. By the time he realized it, Pryor's multiple sclerosis had progressed, making performing nearly impossible. The chance to give one of comedy's greatest voices a bigger stage had slipped away. For Carson, it became a career misstep he openly regretted. Another regret came from losing touch with Don Rickles. Once a fixture in the early years, Rickles drifted away after crossing a sensitive line. Carson never fully forgave him. Years later, he tried to reconnect, but the spark was gone. It weighed on him. The two had created unforgettable moments together, with Rickles' playful insults bouncing off Carson's straight-man responses. But a boundary was crossed, and things changed. A Tonight Show producer explained that Carson divided his life sharply. On stage, he was game for any joke, but in private, he guarded topics like his marriages and family. The breaking point happened in the 1970s when Rickles joked on air about Carson's divorce and alimony. Carson laughed in public, but was livid backstage, feeling betrayed. "Johnny didn't yell," said a staff writer. "He just froze Rickles out, and Rickles knew he'd gone too far." Though Rickles kept returning to the show, the warmth faded. Carson's laughs sounded more controlled, and their banter felt strained. In later years, Carson invited Rickles to dinner, trying to rebuild the bond. They were polite, but never close again. "I shouldn't have let that joke change things, but I did," Carson later admitted. Rickles himself acknowledged the distance after Carson's death. He praised their history, but noted Johnny's grudges. "Once you landed in his bad books, it was almost impossible to get out. I stayed there a long time." Then came his quiet exit from television. When Carson signed off in 1992, he refused nearly every interview, tribute, or special. In private, he admitted the farewell felt hollow. "I wish I'd given more thanks," he later told a friend. His last broadcast drew more than 50 million viewers, ending with a rare, emotional goodbye. Yet after that, Carson vanished, rejecting tributes, retrospectives, and appearances. For a man who had been part of people's lives every night, the silence was shocking. Carson thought cutting ties cleanly was best, said longtime producer Peter LaSalle. He believed in leaving before anyone wished him gone. But he underestimated how abrupt it would feel to both fans and himself. Friends say this final choice left him unsettled for years afterward. Though he felt no remorse about leaving television, what weighed on him was stepping away without properly thanking the staff, crew, and network that had supported him for decades. Roughly 6 months after stepping down, Johnny confided, "I think I should have done more to show my gratitude," said a close friend. By refusing tributes and retrospectives, he came to see that he'd lost the opportunity to publicly recognize the many people who kept the show alive. This lack of a fitting farewell reportedly deepened Carson's solitude in retirement. Because he skipped the closure a bigger send-off would have offered, he had trouble shifting from star entertainer to private individual. Johnny once remarked, "I left the celebration without saying goodbye, and now I can't return to fix it," shared a former writer who stayed in touch after Carson left TV. That's likely why he avoided public events for years. He felt the chance for gratitude had slipped away, a regret that haunted him with no resolution. So how bitter was he about NBC? 7. Trusting the network too much. For years, NBC denied Carson full control of The Tonight Show and tried more than once to edge him out. His regret was clear when he said, "You give a network your life and they still keep a knife behind your back." He often wished he had broken free earlier. Carson's three-decade bond with NBC brought massive success for both, but beneath the surface of ratings and revenue were constant tensions Carson regretted not challenging more. Early on, Johnny was the goose laying golden eggs, yet NBC never trusted him with the nest, recalled a former executive who worked with Carson's team. The network held on to authority over key parts of the show longer than seemed reasonable, given Johnny's proven track record. Ownership was the central struggle. Unlike today's late-night hosts, who usually own their programs through production companies, Carson spent 20 years essentially as NBC staff. Only in 1981 did he secure ownership and create Carson Productions, a step he later admitted should have happened far sooner. Johnny said waiting until his mid-50s to gain control was his worst business mistake, recalled his lawyer Henry Bushkin. He figured he'd lost at least $100 million by not pushing for ownership back in the 60s. Making it worse, Carson knew NBC had repeatedly looked at possible replacements. Internal memos later revealed talks about grooming alternatives even while Carson was at his peak. In the late 80s, Johnny discovered NBC had scouted other hosts nearly every contract cycle, according to a longtime producer. After everything he gave the network, it felt like a betrayal. He once told me, "You give a network your life and they still keep a knife behind your back." This erosion of trust shaped how Carson approached his own succession. He quietly preferred David Letterman, but offered no public push, leaving NBC free to choose Jay Leno, a decision he came to regret. In private conversations later, he often said he should have gone independent earlier and managed his legacy more directly, shared a close associate. He wished he had realized much sooner that networks serve only their own interests, never loyalty, and that's the plain truth of it.